Who here has followed the events of the past weekend down in Santa Barbara? Each year, about 15,000 college students make their way to Santa Barbara during spring break to celebrate something called Deltopia. They weren't doing this when I was at Cal Poly, but it's an enormous street party. Things typically can get a little rowdy. There's the usual suspects of kids having a little bit too much to drink, maybe not covering up everything that should be covered. But something really different happened this year. This year, over 100 people were arrested. 44 people were taken to the hospital. 6 police officers were taken to the hospital. One of them was seriously injured when someone hit him in the face with a full backpack of alcohol bottles. Another was hit in the head with a brick. What began as just a giant street party turned into a riot by the end of the night. Police had to use rubber bullets and tear gas to disperse the crowds. Some of the students said that the police officers began to use violence indiscriminately. And the students, no angels themselves, tore 5 or 6 stop signs out of the ground and began using them as weapons. They also were vandalizing parked cars and trying to flip them over. As everyone recovers from the events of last weekend and maybe even looks for a good lawyer, people are wondering just how it is that things got out of hand so quickly. They wonder how college-aged youth, like these wonderful young adults here, can just get so out of control. Maybe even how the police can get out of control. Something happens when 15,000 people get together, and it wasn't just the beer either. I can't remember the last time that I heard about an individual college student or young person ripping up stop signs out of the ground. And I can't remember the last time that an individual police officer was accused of using force indiscriminately. But maybe a group of students, a group of police officers, we hear about this more often. So what is it about being a crowd that makes people go nuts? What makes people ignore their values and ignore who they are and just go along blindly with the crowd, no matter what kind of mischief they get into? What makes people in the crowd afraid to be the same kind of person inside and outside of a crowd? In our reading this morning, we see the fickleness and eventually the madness of this crowd that's gathered in Jerusalem that cheers when Jesus enters. There's a large crowd gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, the Jewish holiday in which the people remember how God liberated them from Egypt. So spirits were high, people were celebrating. And in the midst of the celebration, Jesus, who the people had been hearing so much about, showed up. The crowd went wild. They cut branches off the trees and waved them in the air. They put branches on the ground to let Jesus walk over them. And then they even took off their own clothes to let Jesus walk over them. He would never be celebrated or received so wildly as he was that day. His followers might have thought, finally, after all this time, the people see in Jesus what we see in him. He really is the Messiah, the one who God has appointed to liberate us from the Romans. But the celebration didn't last long. The fickle crowd tires of Jesus and looks for someone even newer, and even more exciting. Jesus, it would seem, has had his 15 minutes of fame, and it's time to move on. When Jesus is arrested and accused of being a dangerous Jewish subversive later that week, no one from the crowd bothers to say anything to defend him. He's had his chance to thrill the crowd, to perform signs and wonders, to heal and to feed people. And now they're gone. When the Roman governor Pilate ruled that Jesus wasn't guilty of being a subversive and that he should let Jesus go, the crowd speaks up. By then they had found their new it boy, a criminal named Barabbas who was about to be executed. The crowd wanted Barabbas to be set free and Jesus to take his place instead. And Pilate didn't have the courage to stand up to the crowd, and he agrees to the perverse exchange. So in 5 days, Jesus goes from being the most celebrated person in Jerusalem and in all of Israel to being the most despised, the most ignored, the most ridiculed. The riotous crowd chose a convicted murderer over someone who offered peace and compassion. The crowd, of course, was gone by the time of the crucifixion. So were most of the disciples, for that fact. Maybe some of them were afraid that the crowd would come back and see them with Jesus and threaten to kill them also. Matthew's gospel tells us that the only followers of Jesus who stayed were the women. The women who were used to feeling excluded, ignored, rejected, remained with Jesus when none of his male disciples did. Now, one thing that needs to be said about this passage is that the Jews are not responsible for killing Jesus. It's a very old, very superficial way of reading this text and its parallels in the other Gospels. It ignores the context in which the crucifixion took place. For starters, the Jews didn't have the authority to execute anyone. They didn't even have the power to prosecute anyone for something like treason. The Jewish people were an occupied people at the mercy of the Roman Empire. The text this morning is about the danger of crowds, the danger of what crowds are capable of if no one has the courage to stand up. It's about how crowds take on a life of their own when no one is strong enough in themselves to say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Anyone in that crowd that first celebrated Jesus and then later called for him to be executed instead of Barabbas could have stood up and said that this was wrong. Pilate, the ultimate authority here, could have had the courage to say, he's innocent, and I refuse to let anything happen to him. But instead, everyone gives up their individuality. They surrender to this large crowd, and they let evil run its course. Nietzsche, who is one of my favorite philosophers, said that in individuals, madness is rare, but in the masses, it is the norm. Something happens when we stop being individuals and we go along with the masses, with the crowd. We ignore the unique, responsible person that God created us to be, and we learn to value more highly what other people think of us and what others expect us to be. A crowd is capable of truly inhuman acts because people aren't concerned about being human, only being approved of. There's more genuine humanity and potential for relationship in two people who accept each other and embrace each other in their individuality, even when they disagree, than there ever is in a group of 15,000 who just go with the flow. A crowd is desperately lonely, seeking acceptance and fulfillment only by pulling more people into itself. It becomes a monster. And sometimes the biggest movements and institutions in our history have been full of people who don't stand up and challenge this monster when its decisions and actions deny people of their humanity and their dignity. Maybe it's not surprising at all that people who value thinking for themselves don't always go along with what's popular and find themselves in smaller groups like this. It takes a special kind of person who feels comfortable expressing their own opinions in the midst of those who might disagree with it. It takes a special kind of person to embrace one who we might disagree with and still call her sister or brother. We've had many of these special kinds of people in our particular Christian tradition. Individuals in our tradition were willing to stand with the African American slaves during the Amistad trial when the vast majority of Americans approved of slavery. Our tradition was also the first to say that there should be no limits for those whom God calls. Previous to our tradition, everyone who was ordained was Caucasian American, and we ordained the first African American. We didn't stop there. We ordained the first woman. That was a real shocker, because we realized that God isn't limited to just men. Anyone can serve. Anyone can be gifted by God for pastoral ministry. We also ordained the first openly gay person, which is perhaps the most shocking of all of these, because we realize that even sexual orientation does not limit who God can gift and who God can call. So we in this tradition have ignored the crowd many times and have done what we thought was right because we value the individual, not the crowd. We value the person who stands up to the crowd when no one else is willing to. We really mean it when we say, whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. We don't require anyone to sign a statement of belief. We don't require you to give a certain amount of money, to make any promises that you might not be willing to keep. We don't make you repeat creeds that sometimes I found myself in other churches crossing my fingers behind my back as I read them aloud. We value the individual here, and we celebrate you. This crowd, though, is stronger than ever. We find ourselves confronted with not only literal physical crowds, but also online crowds, with virtual crowds. We find ourselves inundated with popular opinion polls, with being told that we're either on the right side or the wrong side of history. There are powerful crowds that want us to be part of them. And it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of skill to learn to hold on to our individuality in this culture. We either have to ignore all forms of media, which, good luck, or else we have to develop the skill of learning to navigate being an individual in this world that values the crowd so much. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to think things through on our own and not listen to what the talking heads on television or the internet tell us. We need to learn to balance what we hear on TV, read online, with maybe something like journaling, where we're able to write down our own thoughts, to think through what we believe and what we value ourselves. We also need to feel okay about not being part of this crowd. We need to feel okay about being a little different, about having an opinion that might be a little different from everyone else's. We need to embrace that not being part of the crowd is just fine. We also need to celebrate that God has made all of us different. Each one of us is a unique mixture of biology and experiences and hopes, and also a vision that God had in mind when God created us. We need to discover that vision and discover what makes each of us unique. And whatever you do, don't force someone else to be unique in the same way that you are. And lastly, as Christian individuals, we need to spend time getting to know Jesus, who was the individual par excellence. Never has anyone challenged crowds and cultures and presuppositions like Jesus. And don't just listen to what other people have to say about Jesus, me included. Read the Gospels. Appreciate in them again and again how Jesus didn't care what anyone thought about him except God. Let's keep meeting together in his name. Let's keep breaking bread together and talking and laughing and even disagreeing with one another. Because when we do so, we show the world that it is possible to stand up to the crowd, that lonely, fickle crowd, and to show them that real individuality, real purpose, real friendship, and fulfillment are possible. Amen.